Hi, it's Jun Cowan here. Recently, I posted an article on LinkedIn about the use of ChatGPT in refereed journal articles, and it created a lot of interest. Most geologists view refereed journal articles as the gold standard in the scientific truth. So when problems like this occur, you get an insight into what is going on in the scientific publication industry. In my post, I mentioned that the problem in the publication industry isn't really ChatGPT, but it's been a long-term problem in the publication of papers that are model-driven, which I call pseudoscientific. What do I mean by that? So I want to discuss this topic in a short video using a real example. So I'm going to start out this discussion by highlighting the text that I've written. In the post, it is plainly obvious that the papers are model-driven. That is the conclusion formulated around SEG-style deposit models before they gather the data, which makes them pseudoscientific. Now, what I mean by pseudoscientific means that the model presented, the interpretation presented, cannot actually be falsified. That is, there is no data presented in the actual paper so that you can go out and test their ideas. Or their data is very one-sided, so that you can't actually sort of obtain a different interpretation from the data that they present. Okay, so there was a comment down here a comment was made by Claudio here. Why would model-driven research be pseudoscience? A genuine question, and that's a fair question. I did give him an answer, but Donald Thompson, the chief geologist of Fosco Limited in Tunisia, gave a perfect answer. So I'll give you his answer. Claudio, the problem is that many geological papers are interpretive and that they lack the clear description of what the deposit or other geological feature the paper is about really looks like. This in part due to the need for brevity, but these papers won't stand the test of time. But a considerable amount of time will lapse before they are corrected by papers supported by observations and accurate descriptions. In the interim, the authors of the earlier papers become peer reviewers and thus gatekeepers to the advancement of new and sometimes contrary models and interpretations. This is not unique to geology, but occurs in all scientific disciplines. And I must agree with everything that Donald says here. That's the way it is, unfortunately. And it is unfortunate that this has been going on for a long time in economic geology. This was actually highlighted recently by a paper by Bruce Hobbs, who's a structural geologist who happens to be my neighbor and my mentor. And he was writing an introductory paper to Structural Geology and Resources Conference special issue. And this was published last year in 2023. He refers to Verncombe in this issue, who considers that early contributions by Connolly, 1936, Newhouse, 1942, and McKinstry, 1948. That structure is a major control to many deposits and emphasizes that structural geology is an essential tool for finding, assessing, and mining almost all deposits. Now, this is quite significant because all these people that Verncombe has mentioned are pre-1950. Okay, keep that in mind. The syngenetic hypothesis came around in the 1950s. And Bruce goes on to say the early works using structural geology in describing mineral systems was performed by truly great observers and not those who were blinkered by bandwagon concepts such as syngenesis. And he includes Stanton here. Okay, so this is the main problem at the moment. and it's been going on since the 1960s, is that structural geology is virtually forgotten, or applied structural geology is virtually forgotten by economic geologists who are now largely geochemists, and they do not document structural geology adequately, and this is not going to stand the test of time. One day, people will start to see the structural significance of these mineral deposits and invalidate a lot of these papers that have been already published since the 1960s. So this issue has been going on for quite a while now, so it's not something new. The paper that I'm going to discuss today is by DeWolfe et al. It was published just recently, 2 months ago, in the January 2024 edition of Economic Geology. Their figure 1 was actually featured in the cover of that journal. And I'll come back to the figure 1 because that's a very important figure that I will discuss. Another reason I want to discuss this paper is that it's one of the most recent VMS papers, and I tend to keep an eye out on all VMS papers. And it's open access, so everyone can have access to this paper, which is great. Okay, this is the paper. I've downloaded it as a PDF file. Now, I'd like to, first of all, apologize to the authors. I'm not trying to pick on you. It's just that this, if you're willing to put your name on any publication to the public, you have to be willing to be criticized openly. So that's what I'm doing here. Okay, one of the statements they make is this: whereas ore forming processes and environments of VMS deposits are well understood, discovering these typically small but high-grade deposits remains a significant challenge, especially in strongly deformed and metamorphosed rocks. So straight up in the introduction, they're already telling you what the ore forming process is. They're basically assuming that these, if you go back to these articles, they're all syngenetic models. So their primary model that they're going to document is the syngenetic model. So this is at the onset, a model-driven paper, and this is not unusual. This has been happening for many decades, and in fact, several generations of geologists have gone through this process. So it's become normalized now that this is the right way to go. And they assume that the strongly deformed and metamorphosed rocks are just basically an annoyance that overprints the mineralization that was syngenetic in the first place. That's an assumption they make at the onset of this paper. Okay, this is kind of important. The focus of the study is a 100-meter thick sequence of mafic volcanic rocks in the Canguilhek Formation in Western Greenland. If you go down to the bottom of the first page, they mention how they describe these rocks. All the Karab group rocks are metamorphosed, but for clarity are described by their protoliths herein. Okay, that's another twist that is important to notice. It's because their model that they're going to actually describe is a syngenetic model. They have to actually describe the protoliths. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. But if you think back to the days of when you were learning geology, you were told to separate observation and interpretation. And these authors don't do this. They don't give a table of the metamorphosed equivalents of the interpreted protoliths that they are going to discuss. They don't do that. So that's a red flag for me. Okay, getting down to figure 1, which was featured in the cover of Economic Geology. This is a really important map, and I'm going to come back to this. So we'll skip over this. That's the location here with the red star. And when I was looking at this, I thought, wow, this is very interesting because they gave you sections and a map, which is this one. This is a photograph here with the section of interest. You can see the massive sulfide. It's labeled here. And you have sulfide stringers down here and so forth. When I looked at this map, I thought, oh, that's very interesting. Layer cake, that's very convincing. So I had no problems with that, the way they presented it. Then I looked at this map. This is the map version of this area here. And I noticed something strange, which is the change in Younging direction. So there is a Younging direction change right here. And what is really odd about this is that they don't actually give you the dip angles of the bedding, which is, to me, really odd. I mean, that is actually critical information. This is an antiformal axis right here, going right through the stratigraphy here. So, I mean, I do not know what this means. Does it mean this is an open fold or a isoclinal fold? So this is the first thing that I noticed after I looked at this sort of seemingly parallel stratigraphy. And you can see that this formation here is on either side. So obviously this is in a fold closure. This is within a fold closure. And it's not entirely obvious in this diagram here at all. Depicting main distribution of lithofacies and mineralization that delineates an anticline. Closure to the north is based on previous mapping by Escher, 1980. Locations of the section Fig 3 shown by dashed white lines. So the dashed white lines indicate the vertical sections, which I'll show you next. So I looked up Escher as well. That was a bit of problematic. So this is the section here, the stratigraphic section, which they call stratigraphic column from south to north. Now, it's the weirdest stratigraphic column that I've ever seen in my life, because I've never seen it ever presented this way, and I'll show you why. See, this is 0 here. This is where they're measuring from this contact right here. That's 0, and they measure upwards that way. But the problem is, this is reversed. Like, the Younging direction is actually upside down here. So this is not the traditional way of measuring stratigraphic sections, and I've measured hundreds of stratigraphic sections. I mean, you never measure them upside down. So this is another red flag, is that they're presenting this stratigraphy upside down in situ until they get to the anticlinal axis at 120 meters, and from that it's the right way up. So this will be called a stratigraphic section. This will be an inverted one, which is really odd. I don't know why they presented it this way. They shouldn't have called it a stratigraphic column. So this is, it makes me suspicious of what the nature of this anticlinal fold hinge is like. I mean, if this is isoclinal and everything looks parallel to each other, right? Then they can present it as if this is a stratigraphic column, but this isn't a stratigraphic column. Hugely problematic. And I don't know how they got this published. Okay, so the next part of the paper goes into the description of the host rocks, which is all pretty standard. And this is something that most VMS papers focus their attention on, are the host rocks. So this is a 10-meter wide massive sulfide here. You can see this very steeply dipping, 80 degrees. And all these descriptions are in here. They call this a sulfide stringer. But something that is completely missing from this description is any structural features. We do not know what this stringer is doing relative to, say, for example, the axial plane of that possibly isoclinal fold. We have no idea. Now, one of the things that I do when I read papers is that I go for the word likely. I search for the word likely. I call it the likely hunting, because likely is a very vague word. Likely could be equally interpreted as being unlikely, right? It's just a guess. And if a major interpretation is based on a guess, and it includes the word likely when they describe the interpretation, then it becomes highly suspect to me. So this is what I do. Okay, so in the discussions, they go into the discussion of synvolcanic faults, and this is the standard practice of VMS papers. They have to somehow show that their interpretation is related to a synvolcanic fault. And, these authors refer to Gibson et al. 1999. So this is the paper here, Gibson et al. 1999. And if you look through this paper, if you scan through it, it's all cartoons. Like there's nothing that is based on actual mapping. There's no data in effect. So I just don't find these type of papers really all that informative. It's just like a model built on a model built on another model. It's just keeps on going. And this is the weakness of the VMS papers, that they cite other papers which are based on ideas that can't be disproven or tested. So they go into the discussion of synvolcanic faults, and this is their model. Very clearly illustrated normal faulting created basins into which volcanoclastic material was deposited, likely by mass debris flows generated along fault scarps. Okay, so far in their paper, they have not illustrated a single synvolcanic fault or a candidate or a synvolcanic fault. Okay. Now, there is an important point, though, that there are structures in here which they did not document. And the most obvious one is that anticlinal hinge. I've discussed this issue in a LinkedIn article several years ago, and I asked everyone, what is the single most feature of volcanic massive sulfide deposit that has been ignored since the 1960s? And I basically stated that these features that are often depicted in the literature, they just simply do not exist in ancient deposits. But these are the pictures from the papers, right? So if you look through this, so that's Noranda, that's Paris Mountain, that's SK Creek, and so forth. You'll notice something very distinctive, and the massive sulfides are associated with folds. Kidd Creek, Panorama. This is a classic, best sheet deposits. I didn't know that it was folded like this. This is just amazing. Just isn't documented. Captain's Flat. And this is a classic one. This is Myra Falls VMS deposit on Vancouver Island. In fact, Vancouver Island, which is, it's basically a large anticline. And the Myra Falls deposit is right in the fold crest. It's located here. A classic. So the list goes on, right? So the most interesting thing about, to me, VMS deposit association is with the folding. So what these authors have done with their paper is to minimize the folding. I mean, this is not new. These are not the first guys to do this. This is a standard practice in VMS literature and also SEDEX literature. Okay, they basically ignore any structural deformation. They don't even document it. In fact, most of the VMS papers, if you look at their maps, they don't have any structural measurements whatsoever. If there were structural measurements from previous maps, they take them out, in fact. There's a really good example of that I could talk about. But this is standard practice. They display the figures in such a way that it looks like conformable stratigraphy until you look at it really closely and you realize that it isn't, right? And that they give you stratigraphic columns that look like stratigraphic columns, but they're not stratigraphic columns. Okay, so this is really important to nail down when you are reading these papers, especially VMS papers, because this is standard practice. Now, I need to go back to figure 1 because this is really important. I sourced the original map produced by Escher. Okay, figure 1 of DeWolfe's paper is on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side is Escher's map, and I've zoomed into the same location. Okay, you can see that outcrop here is the same as this outcrop here. Okay, so the location of the mineral deposit, according to this map, should be right here somewhere. And there is no discernible information on this Escher's map about any fold closure. So I don't know what they're referring to when they said that there's a fold closure according to Escher's map. That's what they stated in the paper. But if you look at their map, fascinating. They have a fold closure right here located. The host rock is the green unit here. And this is actually right in the fold hinge of this unit, this contact, with the basement rocks, which are in this sort of mauve color. So clearly the authors know that there is an anticlinal closure here because they've actually shown it in the map, in their map. And they referred to this map over here, which doesn't show that information. So I was wondering whether there was another map that actually displayed this type of structural feature. So I went looking around for another map of this region, and I found a paper that was published in May 2023, so half a year before DeWolfe's paper. And if you go to their figure, this one here, figure 3, their main area of interest is in the north. But at the southern end of this map, you have this area. This is the area that we're interested in. This is the same area here. So if we zoom up to that. Okay, zoomed up, Grocot's map looks like this, and DeWolfe's map is over here. And clearly you can see the similarity between these two maps. You can see the antiformal closure here, and also over here. The dip on this side, on this limb, is dipping steeply to the east, and on this side dipping steeply to the west. So that is a closure, and they're both steeply dipping, which means that we must be dealing with a isoclinal fold here. Now along strike you don't see that green unit as they've mapped it. It's over or located over here. So we're not sure if this somehow joins up, but clearly there's missing information. There's a lot of structural information here. This must be based on detailed mapping, but there is nothing on this side. Now, for these authors over here to claim that the structural data is based on Escher is completely, well, you cannot verify that information from looking at Escher's map. Clearly, what they know is something much more and similar to what's been published by Grocott et al. So it makes me wonder, why do they do that? Do they hide the information for a purpose so that they can make a story out of their VMS interpretation? I don't know. The authors didn't really sort of disclose this information. So if you are going to read this paper as is, you are basically left in the dark unless you can access all these papers, which this one happens to be open access actually. So both papers are open access, and I've given the link to these in my article on LinkedIn. But so you can look at the details of that. I've also given the link to this map as well, so you can check it out yourself. Now, the structural nature of this, where this deposit is located, is really de-emphasized in DeWolfe's paper. What they really know is this structural situation, I believe, but they don't seem to disclose it, apart from the fact that they actually have this in their figure 1. It has nothing to do with Escher. This is a bit of a worry. Given that they know the structural configuration here, I would have done something completely different with their stratigraphic column that they've displayed before. Okay, so this is their stratigraphic column, and you can see the Young direction change here, and they've displayed it as a stratigraphic column. I believe this is so that the reader gets an impression that the original configuration of the stratigraphy was important to the mineralization. Now, another way of actually displaying this information is to take a more realistic way, I think, is to take a cross-section through there. What they could have done was to take a cross-section through here and drawn in the stratigraphy that way. Then that way you can actually show the stratigraphy and you can show the structure at the same time, but they didn't do this. They decided to completely do away with any structural information that is associated with this deposit. So ironically, even though DeWolfe et al. Have de-emphasized the structural nature or the structural position of this sulfide deposit, this is clearly associated with a hinge of possibly an isoclinal fold. It's clearly seen in this map. Now, ironically, this really fits in very well with an article I've written on LinkedIn about the structural association of VMS deposits with fold closures. So this idea that the VMS deposits are associated with deformation, folding, fits in very well with DeWolfe's paper, ironically, even though their conclusion is syngenetic. Now, obviously, if the authors want us readers to take them seriously, they really do need to document this fold. And it's just simply not documented. It's just in this little map that's shrunk down so small that you can barely see the details. To me, this is not good enough. And I do not know why economic geology is allowing papers like this to be published. They should actually give an explanation as to why they did that, why they allowed them to be published like this. But I can see that this is standard practice. Now, how can I claim that this is standard practice? Getting back to the paper, all you have to do is just type in synvolcanic, and this word will be associated with synvolcanic growth faults or synvolcanic faults or the variation of that. So if you look at that, you just sort of type it in and then go, okay, there are 12 examples of this. You can search through this, synvolcanic normal faults, synvolcanic fault. All these are associated with synvolcanic, or not that one, but faulting, synvolcanic faults. Curious thing about this, so it's about like 10 of those searches, synvolcanic, is related to faulting. 10 of those 12 searches that I just did is referring to this hypothetical synvolcanic fault where there is zero field evidence. Okay, let's search for the fold. If I search for fold, okay, so you have anticlinal fold axis, that's one. That doesn't count, that's in the reference. Anticlinal fold. So, okay, there are 2 mentions of fold. But in figure 1, clearly there is a fold associated with this mineralization, but it's mentioned twice in the paper. This is based on field evidence. It's been verified in another paper, yet they do not focus on it. They do not discuss it, but they mention 10 times a hypothetical syn volcanic fault. Do you think this is fair? I don't think this is fair at all. But like I said, this is standard practice. All you have to do is open up papers from the past that describe VMS deposits and search for real structures as opposed to hypothetical structures, just like as I have demonstrated in this paper, and you'll find the same pattern. And it's been going on for decades. This isn't the first paper. There are a whole bunch of papers that operate this way, and it's always been like this for decades. So people who were probably lecturers of DeWolfe were probably taught by people who were already converted to this system, and we've gone through about 3 generations now. So yeah, it's a difficult thing to actually get over, but number one, I think the editors of these journals have to be really careful about what they publish, because this paper and other papers like this are not going to stand the test of time. So I come back to Donald Thompson's comment where he said, but these papers won't stand the test of time, but a considerable amount of time will elapse before they are corrected by papers supported by observations and accurate descriptions. Now I can tell you DeWolfe's paper isn't accurate. It is missing a very important component in the puzzle, and that needs to be described. But how do you do this accurate description? I've written an article about this, and it comes from old literature actually, prior to the 1960s. So if you look at any of these books, you can see accurate structural measurements made at mines. You know how the mineral deposits are actually controlled because they've documented the structural features, and they've produced some amazing 3-dimensional diagrams. Like, look at this. This is up to the standards of today. Yet people do not know how to do this anymore because they don't measure structural features and they just ignore them. Remember that the syngenetic ideas came after the abandonment of all these accurate descriptions that went on up till about the 1960s. So I think it's really important to bring back that tradition. So I come back to Bruce Hobbs' paper here, and he mentions this bandwagon concepts, blinkered by bandwagon concepts, okay? And VMS model is one such bandwagon concept. It is basically, it gained strength over decades because people have basically stopped documenting structural geology. We really do not know the relationships between these deposits and structural form. And this is something that's really important to me because it affects the entire mining industry and exploration industry. If we are exploring for these deposits using erroneous concepts, then we're not going to get anywhere. This is something that has a practical bent to it. So yeah, I think it's a very important subject. Okay, so if you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up on LinkedIn. And yeah, if you want more videos like this, please let me know and I'll record some more. Thank you.